"I'm in love with someone else," said the billionaire CEO. 3 years later, he saw her with triplets. Marlon hadn't planned on stopping at the park that afternoon. It was just a shortcut between meetings, a place he usually passed without noticing. Parents on benches, kids running, nothing that ever belonged to his world. Then he saw her. She was sitting near the fountain, sunlight resting gently on her face, her hair pulled back the same way she used to when she didn't want it in her eyes. For a moment, his mind refused to connect the image to reality. Frida was supposed to exist in memories, not here, not now. And then he noticed the 3 small figures around her. 3 children, all calling her name, all reaching for her attention as if it belonged to them completely. Marlon stopped walking without realizing he had done it. 1 foot still forward, his phone forgotten in his hand, his body frozen in the middle of a crowded path. People moved around him, brushing past, talking, laughing, living. He didn't register any of it. His focus narrowed until the entire park felt like it had emptied out, leaving only 1 bench, 1 woman, and 3 children who shouldn't exist in his present. His heart thudded in a way it hadn't in years, not fast, heavy, like it was trying to remind him of something he'd buried too carefully. He blinked once, twice, as if his eyes might correct the scene for him. They didn't. His breath caught halfway in. He felt it in his chest first, then in his throat. The kind of disbelief that isn't loud, isn't dramatic, just quiet and disorienting. The kind that makes you wonder if you've stepped into the wrong life for a moment. His mind searched for explanations. Maybe it was someone who looked like her. Maybe he was tired. Maybe his memory was playing tricks on him. But the way she tilted her head when she laughed, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear, there was no mistake. It was Frida. Frida leaned forward on the bench, holding a small juice box in one hand while 2 of the children tried to grab it at the same time. Their voices overlapped in playful protest, each insisting it was theirs. She laughed. Not the polite kind, not the kind people use in public spaces to be courteous. It was real, effortless, the same laugh Marlon remembered from late nights on her couch when something silly happened and neither of them tried to look composed. One of the children climbed onto her lap, wrapping small arms around her neck. Another stood in front of her, explaining something with exaggerated seriousness as if it were the most important story in the world. Frida listened fully, not half attentive, not distracted. Her eyes stayed on them, warm and focused, as though nothing else around her deserved priority. She brushed a hand over one child's hair, wiped a bit of juice from another's chin, and smiled with a softness that didn't feel performative or careful. It wasn't the version of her that existed in memories, gentle, hopeful, waiting. This version wasn't waiting for anything. She was exactly where she belonged. Marlon felt something settle in his chest, slow and unfamiliar. Not pain exactly, not even regret in the way he'd imagined it over the years. It was the realization that she didn't look like someone who had lost anything. There was no trace of absence in her posture, no sense that a part of her life had gone missing and never been replaced. She wasn't searching the crowd. She wasn't distracted. She wasn't holding space for something that never arrived. She looked finished, in the quiet way people do when they stop waiting for another chapter and start living inside the one they're already in. He had always pictured her as someone who would need time. Time to recover, time to heal, time to build something new after what they had been. But sitting there, surrounded by 3 small lives that depended on her completely, she didn't look like someone who had moved on. She looked like someone who had arrived. And for the first time since the day he walked away, Marlon understood something that felt almost uncomfortable in its honesty. She hadn't needed him to become this version of herself. She had needed him to leave. Marlon stood there longer than he should have, watching a life he no longer had any place in. And as strange as it felt, he knew this wasn't just a moment meant for him alone. Hi, and welcome. If this is your first time here, my name is Mr. Cooper, and on this channel, we tell human stories. Not perfect ones, not dramatic fantasies, just real moments about choices, timing, and the quiet ways life changes people. And if you've been here before, welcome back. You already know. These stories aren't about heroes or villains. They're about ordinary people facing decisions that seem small in the moment, but end up shaping everything. Because sometimes the most important turning points don't happen with noise. They happen on a random afternoon, in a park you never planned to stop at, when you see someone you thought you'd left behind, living a life that no longer includes you. Before we go any deeper into this story, I want to say this gently. If you enjoy stories that feel real, the kind that stay with you long after they end, I'd love for you to become part of this space. You can subscribe to the channel and join a community that values quiet storytelling, emotional honesty, and moments that reflect real life rather than perfect endings. No pressure, just an invitation. Because every story here is about connection, and sometimes simply choosing to stay for the next one is its own small way of saying, "This matters to me." Marlon finally looked away from the bench, not because he wanted to, but because something inside him couldn't hold the moment any longer. 3 years ago, he had been sitting in a different place, a quiet cafe, a familiar table, the kind of afternoon that felt harmless at the time. And across from him was the same woman, not as a mother, not as someone else's whole world. Just Frida, the person who once believed in him before anyone needed his name to mean something. 3 years ago, he had looked at her and said the sentence that felt safest in his mouth. "I'm in love with someone else." He had said it calmly, carefully, as if the words were already distant enough not to hurt either of them too deeply. At the time, he believed that was the moment his life became simpler. Standing in the park now, watching her laugh with 3 children who shared her smile, he understood that was actually the moment his life quietly split in two. The one he chose, and the one he lost. Marlon had replayed that cafe moment in his mind more times than he cared to admit, not obsessively, not with tears or dramatic regret, just in quiet flashes, usually late at night, usually when everything else was silent. Back then it felt like a clean decision, a practical one, a choice that promised stability, certainty, and a future that didn't require emotional risk. So how did it lead here? How did a man who once felt understood without having to explain himself end up standing alone in a park, watching the person who knew him best build a life that didn't need him at all? There was no single mistake he could point to, no obvious moment where everything went wrong, just a series of small choices that felt reasonable at the time. Small distances that grew into permanent ones, small hesitations that became entire lives. And now, 3 years later, the question he couldn't escape wasn't whether he made the right decision back then. It was whether a life can still feel successful when the person who mattered most no longer fits inside it. Marlon took one last look at Frida before finally turning away. Not because the moment had lost its meaning, but because it had gained too much. There are some memories that don't fade with time. They don't soften. They don't become easier to hold. They just wait, quietly, until life puts you face to face with what you chose to leave behind. He had always believed that the hardest part of his story was learning how to succeed. He was wrong. The hardest part was learning how to live with the moments that could never be revisited, the words that could never be taken back, and the version of himself that only existed in the past. This wasn't the story he planned to tell. It wasn't the story that made him look impressive or in control, but it was the one that stayed with him the longest. This is the part I never thought I'd tell. Before Marlon became a name people recognized, he was just a man who liked simple routines. He woke up early, not because he had to, but because he enjoyed quiet mornings. He drank his coffee slowly. He read physical books instead of news headlines. He still answered his own emails. Still walked instead of taking cars when the weather allowed. Success had already found him back then, but it hadn't consumed him. He remembered birthdays. He showed up on time. He listened when people spoke, not because it was useful, but because he was genuinely curious about how other people thought and felt. He didn't see life as a series of strategies. He saw it as something to experience, and most importantly, he hadn't learned yet how to separate his public value from his private self. He was still reachable, the kind of person who could sit in one place for hours, not checking the time, not thinking about what came next, not calculating how a moment might benefit him later. He didn't feel rushed. He didn't feel watched. He didn't feel like every decision had to protect something. Back then, Marlon didn't live inside expectations. He lived inside moments. Frida entered his life without any dramatic arrival. No big coincidence, no sudden connection, just a shared table at a small cafe when the place was too crowded for comfort, and neither of them felt like waiting. She had been reading a book, the kind with folded corners and scribbled notes in the margins. When he apologized for interrupting her space, she smiled and said she didn't mind. Not in a polite way, in a way that made it feel like she genuinely meant it. Frida was thoughtful without being distant, warm without being loud, the kind of person who noticed things most people ignored. The tone behind words, the way silence changed when someone felt uncomfortable, the difference between listening and waiting to speak. She asked questions that weren't meant to impress. She laughed easily, but not carelessly. She thought before she answered, not because she was unsure, but because she liked choosing her words carefully. What stood out most to Marlon wasn't her beauty, though she had a quiet kind of it. It was how present she was. When she looked at someone, she wasn't already planning her next sentence. She stayed in the moment, fully, as if nothing else deserved her attention more. And without realizing it, Marlon found himself doing the same around her. Their first real conversation lasted far longer than either of them expected. It started with something small, a comment about the book she was reading, a casual question about whether she liked the author's earlier work. Frida closed the book halfway through a sentence, not because she felt obligated to respond, but because she wanted to, They talked about nothing important at first. Favorite cities, songs they never admitted liking, the strange comfort of sitting alone in public spaces. There was no rush in the conversation, no sense of trying to impress. Just two people discovering, quietly, that they enjoyed hearing each other's thoughts. At some point, Marlon realized he hadn't checked his phone in over an hour, not because he was trying to be respectful, but because he'd forgotten it existed. Frida stirred sugar into her coffee, even though she had already added milk. When he teased her about it, she laughed and said habits weren't always logical, they were just familiar. He liked that answer more than he expected. When they finally stood up to leave, neither of them mentioned the time. They simply exchanged numbers, as if it were the most natural continuation of the afternoon. Their messages turned into calls, and their calls turned into long exchanges that didn't need a reason. One night, Frida sent Marlon a song she loved, followed by a simple line, "This feels like you." He listened to it twice, then 3 times, not because it was extraordinary, but because it captured a mood he hadn't known how to describe. He replied with a song of his own. And just like that, they started building something neither of them admitted mattered, a shared playlist. They added to it slowly. No announcements, no expectations, just quiet contributions, each song reflecting a feeling they didn't always say out loud. Some tracks were soft, some were nostalgic. Some felt like moments neither of them had lived yet. Marlon began to recognize Frida's choices before he even saw her name attached. He could tell when she was in a thoughtful mood, when she felt light, when she needed something comforting. And she noticed the same about him. Without realizing it, they were learning how to communicate through music, not with explanations, but with presence. It became their language, one that didn't require any effort to understand. They started meeting after dinner, when the city felt quieter and the day had already lost its urgency. No plans, no destinations, just walking. Sometimes they talked about serious things, family, fears, the kind of future they imagined without committing to anything specific. Other times, they walked in comfortable silence, listening to the sound of their steps, the rhythm of breathing, the subtle feeling of sharing space without needing to fill it. Frida liked looking into lit windows as they passed apartment buildings, guessing what kind of lives people lived inside. Marlon liked that she never turned those guesses into judgments. Just curiosity. They walked slowly, not because they were tired, but because neither of them wanted the evening to end too quickly. There was something grounding about moving forward together without needing to know where they were going. For Marlon, it felt like the opposite of everything else in his life. No timelines, no pressure, no outcomes to manage, just presence. And somehow, that felt more intimate than anything he'd experienced before. Not every moment between them needed words. They could sit side by side on a bench, coffee cooling in their hands, the world moving around them, and say nothing at all. At first, Marlon worried the quiet meant something was missing. He had been trained by years of professional conversations to believe that silence needed to be filled, managed, or redirected. But with Frida, the quiet felt different. It wasn't awkward. It wasn't tense. It didn't ask for anything. It felt settled. Sometimes she leaned her head back and closed her eyes, just listening to the sounds around them. Other times he watched people pass by and found himself strangely content not sharing every thought. They weren't performing connection. They were experiencing it. And in those silences, Marlon felt something rare. Not excitement, not urgency, but ease, the kind that doesn't demand proof to exist. Frida always added sugar to her coffee, even when it was already sweet. Not because she liked it better that way, she admitted she barely noticed the difference, but because it was what she'd always done, a small routine she carried from place to place without questioning. Marlon noticed it one afternoon when they were sitting near the window of the same cafe where they'd first met. She stirred slowly, absent-mindedly, watching people outside instead of the cup in her hand. "You know it's already sweet, right?" he said, half smiling. She looked down at the coffee, then back at him. "I know," she replied. "I just like knowing I put it there." He didn't fully understand what she meant, but something about it stayed with him. It wasn't about the sugar. It was about choice, about intention, about finding comfort in small, familiar actions. Later, whenever he ordered coffee alone, he found himself stirring it the same way, not because he wanted it sweeter, but because it reminded him of her. Frida had a habit of drifting toward windows whenever a conversation became heavy, not in a way that felt dismissive, but thoughtful, as if she needed to look at something open and distant to process what she was feeling. Marlon noticed it during one of their longer talks about family. She stood near the glass watching people move along the street below, her reflection faintly visible beside them. When he asked what she was thinking about, she didn't answer right away. "Sometimes," she said slowly, "I just need space for a thought to land before I say it out loud." He liked that about her. She didn't rush her emotions. She didn't speak just to fill silence. She allowed herself time to understand what she felt, and being around someone who treated their own inner world with that much care made Marlon more aware of his own. He started noticing when he avoided certain thoughts, when he spoke before he felt, when he chose clarity over honesty. Frida never pointed those things out. She just showed him, quietly, that another way of being existed. One evening they were sitting on her couch, a movie playing quietly in the background neither of them was paying attention to. Frida rested her head against his shoulder, not as a dramatic gesture but naturally, the way someone does when they feel safe. "You don't have to be impressive with me," she said softly. "You know that, right?" Marlon smiled, a genuine one that reached his eyes. "That's exactly why I feel like I can breathe around you." He meant it in a way he had never said to anyone else. Around her, he didn't feel like a version of himself that needed to perform. He didn't feel watched. He didn't feel evaluated. He felt human, not the man people expected, not the future everyone planned for. Just himself sitting on a couch, sharing space with someone who didn't ask him to be anything more. And without realizing it, that sense of relief became the foundation of everything they were building. The shift didn't happen all at once. At first, Marlon barely noticed it. A few more emails in the morning, a few more meetings added to his calendar, a few more people who wanted his opinion on things that felt far removed from the life he actually lived. Bigger offices, bigger numbers, bigger expectations. He started traveling more, spending nights in hotel rooms that all looked the same, waking up to views he didn't have time to enjoy. His phone rang constantly. His inbox never emptied. There was always another decision waiting. People spoke about his work with admiration, sometimes even awe. They treated his time like it was more valuable than anyone else's, as if every minute of his day needed to be justified by productivity. At first it felt flattering, then it felt necessary, and slowly, without realizing it, Marlon began organizing his life around what the company required, instead of what he actually wanted. Not because he was forced to, but because success has a quiet way of convincing you that it deserves more of you than anything else ever could. The meetings started to change in tone before Marlon fully understood what that meant. They were no longer just about ideas or growth. They became about influence, positioning, and long-term control. Rooms filled with people who spoke carefully, choosing every word as if it carried weight beyond the conversation itself. He found himself sitting across polished tables, listening to questions that weren't really questions. Where do you see yourself in 5 years? What kind of partnerships are you open to? How do you plan to protect the brand image? None of them asked how he felt. They asked how he planned. His role shifted from creator to symbol, from someone building something meaningful to someone representing something valuable. And with that shift came subtle pressure, not spoken directly, not written anywhere, just the unspoken understanding that every choice he made, personal or professional, now reflected on more than just himself. It was no longer enough to be successful. He had to be acceptable. The boardroom felt different from any space Marlon had ever been in. The chairs were comfortable, the walls clean, the air controlled, but the atmosphere carried a kind of quiet tension. Conversations moved quickly, not because people were excited, but because no one wanted to reveal more than necessary. Disagreements were expressed through polite smiles. Concerns were wrapped in careful language. Decisions were framed as opportunities even when they felt like compromises. Marlon noticed how emotions were treated, not as something dangerous, just irrelevant. Personal stories were brushed aside. Doubts were redirected toward data. Any hesitation was met with charts, projections, and reassurances that logic mattered more than instinct. He learned quickly that in this space, vulnerability didn't create trust, it created uncertainty, and uncertainty was something no one wanted attached to their investments. He listened more than he spoke. He nodded more than he questioned. He learned how to keep his inner reactions to himself, not because he stopped feeling them, but because he stopped seeing where they belonged. The invitations started arriving without explanation. Dinners at private clubs, charity events, gatherings that felt more like carefully arranged meetings than social occasions. Marlon was introduced to people whose names carried weight, not because of who they were, but because of who they were connected to. He shook hands with parents who spoke about their children's futures as if they were already written. He listened to conversations where relationships were discussed in terms of compatibility, advantage, and alignment. And slowly, almost casually, women were introduced to him. Not with direct intentions, not with pressure that could be pointed out, just subtle suggestions, framed as coincidence. You two would get along. She comes from a wonderful family. You share similar values. No one asked whether he felt anything. They assumed feeling would follow structure. And for the first time, Marlon realized that in these rooms, love wasn't something people discovered. It was something they arranged. The more time Marlon spent in those circles, the more familiar the pattern became. Each woman he met felt carefully selected, not for who she was in quiet moments, but for how well her life fit into a story others were already telling about him. They were accomplished, well-spoken, educated at the right places, their families were respected, their careers impressive without being intimidating. On paper, everything aligned. Conversations flowed easily, but they felt curated, as if both sides knew they were being evaluated, not simply known. He noticed how often people said the same phrases. "She's a great match for you. You'd make a powerful couple. You complement each other." No one ever said, "You look happy together." Because happiness wasn't the point. Compatibility was measured through status, not connection, through future potential, not present feeling. And without meaning to, Marlon began to question something he'd never doubted before. Whether love was something you felt or something you selected. Marlon noticed that whenever he tried to speak about anything personal, the room subtly shifted. Not with discomfort, not with judgment, just with polite redirection. If he mentioned feeling uncertain, someone would respond with a plan. If he admitted doubt, someone would bring up statistics. If he spoke about stress, someone would suggest delegation. There was always a solution ready, but never space for the feeling itself. It became clear that emotions were not forbidden. They were simply inconvenient. They slowed conversations. They complicated decisions. They introduced variables that couldn't be controlled or predicted. So Marlon learned to keep those parts of himself quiet. Not because anyone asked him to, but because he could sense what didn't belong. In these spaces, success was built on clarity, confidence, and forward motion. Anything that required reflection was treated like excess weight, and without realizing it, he began leaving entire parts of himself outside the rooms where his future was being decided. The change in Marlon wasn't dramatic. There were no sudden arguments, no obvious mistakes, just small shifts that accumulated quietly. He checked his phone more often during conversations. His replies became shorter, more delayed. He started canceling plans he used to look forward to, replacing them with meetings that felt necessary but never satisfying. When he was with Frida, his mind wandered, not because he didn't care, but because he was always carrying something else with him, a deadline, a decision, a message he needed to respond to. His laughter came a second later than it used to. His attention felt divided, his presence less complete. Frida noticed it before he did. She didn't accuse him. She didn't complain. She just started watching him more closely, not to monitor him, but to understand where he was slowly going. Frida didn't confront him right away. At first she told herself it was temporary, that everyone gets busy, that success naturally demands more time. But she felt it in the spaces between his words, in the way he paused before answering simple questions, in the way his eyes drifted toward his phone even when nothing was ringing, in the way his mind seemed somewhere else even while sitting right in front of her. He still showed up, but not fully. One evening they were walking together, the same streets they used to wander without direction. This time he kept glancing at the time, his steps slightly faster than hers. She slowed down, not to test him, just to see if he'd notice. He didn't. That was the moment she understood something had shifted, not because he cared less, but because something else had started to matter more. The conversation happened in her living room, on a night that felt ordinary enough not to prepare either of them for it. Frida was sitting on the edge of the couch, her hands resting in her lap. Marlon stood near the window, half listening to a call he had just ended. "You've been slowly leaving for weeks," she said quietly. "You just haven't said it out loud yet." He turned toward her, surprised by the calm in her voice. "What do you mean?" he asked. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't list examples. She didn't argue. "I feel like I'm sharing space with someone who's already somewhere else." The room felt still. Marlon opened his mouth to reassure her, to say it wasn't true, that he was just busy, that things would return to normal. But the words didn't come, because somewhere inside him he knew she wasn't wrong. And the realization unsettled him more than any accusation ever could. The cafe hadn't changed. Same narrow tables, same soft music in the background, same smell of coffee and baked bread drifting through the air. It was the kind of place that stayed exactly as it was, even when the people inside it became completely different. Marlon arrived early, not because he was eager, but because he didn't trust himself to arrive on time. He needed a few minutes alone, a moment to steady his thoughts before facing the conversation he had been avoiding for weeks. He chose the same table they used to sit at, not intentionally, not consciously. It just felt familiar. He placed his phone face down on the table, ordered a drink he didn't really want, and stared at the empty chair across from him. About whether it was something people found or something they decided. Back then, it had felt like a harmless conversation. Now, it felt like a warning he hadn't taken seriously. The door opened. Frida walked in, scanning the room until her eyes found him, and for a second everything inside him hesitated. He had arrived nearly 20 minutes before they agreed to meet, not because he wanted to sit there longer, but because he didn't know what to do with himself anywhere else. He kept checking the door, then looking back at the table, then down at his hands. His coffee cooled untouched. The noise around him blurred into a low hum he couldn't focus on. He rehearsed sentences in his head, short ones, clear ones that sounded reasonable instead of honest. He reminded himself why he was there, why this conversation needed to happen, why avoiding it would only make everything harder later. Still, when the door opened again and he saw Frida step inside, his first instinct wasn't relief. It was the urge to stand up and leave before she saw him. Because once she sat down, there would be no pretending left, only choices he had already made, and the consequences waiting to be spoken out loud. Frida walked in with the same quiet energy she always had. Not rushed, not distracted, just present. She spotted Marlon almost immediately and smiled, lifting a hand in a small wave before making her way toward the table. "Sorry if I'm late," she said, even though she wasn't. "The bus took longer than I expected." He shook his head quickly. "No, you're right on time." She sat down, placing her bag beside her chair, glancing at his untouched coffee. "You've been waiting a while, haven't you?" He nodded. "A little." She smiled again gently. "You should have ordered something you actually like." The way she said it felt familiar, intimate, the kind of comment that came from knowing someone well enough to notice small habits. She leaned back in her chair, relaxed, unaware of the weight pressing against his chest. "So," she said, her tone light, "what's going on? You sounded serious on the phone." There was no tension in her voice, no suspicion, just trust. And that made everything he was about to say feel heavier than it already did. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The space between them felt different from the comfortable silences they used to share. This one carried weight. It asked for something. It waited. Marlon wrapped his fingers around his cup, not to drink, but to ground himself. Frida watched him with quiet curiosity, her head tilted slightly, as if she were trying to read something he wasn't saying. "You okay?" she asked softly. He nodded too quickly. "Yeah, just thinking about how to start." She smiled, trying to ease the moment. "You don't have to prepare a speech." That was the problem. He had prepared one. And now that he was here, sitting across from the person who still looked at him with warmth instead of distance, the words felt smaller than they had in his head. The noise of the cafe faded again. The clinking of cups, the low conversations, the movement around them, all of it blurred into something distant. What remained was the space between their eyes, and the growing awareness that whatever he said next would change everything. Marlon took a slow breath, the kind people take when they know there's no turning back. "I've been meaning to tell you something," he said. Frida straightened slightly in her seat, attentive but calm. Okay, he had practiced this, in hotel rooms, in empty cars, in his mind during meetings that went on too long. The words were arranged carefully, not dramatic, not cruel, just distant enough to protect both of them, or so he believed. "I think I need to be honest with you," he continued, "about where my head's been lately." She nodded, waiting. "I've been thinking a lot, about the future, about what I want, about what makes sense for me right now." There it was. The opening he had built around the sentence he didn't want to say directly, and even as he spoke he could feel how safe the language sounded, how little it revealed of what he actually felt, how much it allowed him to stay in control. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, not long enough for Frida to notice, but long enough for him to feel it. "I'm in love with someone else," he said. The sentence landed softly, no raised voice, no dramatic pause, just a statement delivered with the same calm tone he used in meetings and presentations. Frida blinked once. Not in shock, not in disbelief, just processing. "Oh," she said quietly. She didn't reach for her bag. She didn't look away. She didn't interrupt him. She simply sat there, absorbing the words as if they were a new piece of information she needed to understand before responding. Marlon watched her closely, waiting for something. Anger, sadness, confusion. Anything that would confirm how serious what he had said actually was. But her face remained still, not cold, not empty, just attentive, and in that moment, he realized the sentence had done exactly what he wanted it to do. It had kept him safe. It hadn't revealed fear. It hadn't revealed doubt. It hadn't revealed how unsure he actually was. It sounded clean, controlled, reasonable, which made it easier to say, and harder to take back. Frida rested her hands on the table, fingers loosely intertwined, as if she were grounding herself in the moment. She didn't rush to speak. She didn't shift in her seat. She simply looked at him, not searching his face, not trying to read between his words, just taking in what he had said as it was. "Are you really?" she asked quietly. There was no accusation in her voice, no sarcasm, no disbelief, just a genuine question. Marlon opened his mouth, then closed it again. The truth hovered somewhere behind the sentence he had practiced, heavier than he expected. "I think I could be," he said finally. "It feels right. It makes sense." She nodded slowly, as if considering that answer. "Since when did love have to make sense?" she asked. The question landed gently, but it didn't fade. It stayed between them, not as an argument, but as something unresolved, something that didn't demand an answer, yet somehow changed everything it touched. Frida's face softened, not with sadness, but with understanding, and that hurt more than any anger ever could. Frida took a slow breath, the kind that comes before acceptance rather than resistance. She reached for her bag, not hurriedly, not with any dramatic movement, just calmly, as if the conversation had already settled inside her. "I hope she loves you the way you need," she said. "Not the way that's convenient." Marlon felt something tighten in his chest, not because the words were sharp, but because they were honest. She stood up, adjusting the strap of her bag over her shoulder, her movements steady, composed. There was no bitterness in her expression, no attempt to make him feel guilty, no effort to hold on to what was already slipping away. She had said what she needed to say, and in doing so she released both of them. He watched her for a moment longer than he should have, wanting to respond, wanting to correct something, wanting to explain what he himself didn't fully understand. But she didn't wait for him to find the right words. She had already chosen hers, and they were enough. Frida turned and walked toward the door without looking back, not because she was trying to be strong, not because she wanted to prove anything, simply because there was nothing left to say. Marlon stayed seated, his hands still resting on the table where hers had been moments before. The space across from him felt suddenly wider, emptier than it ever had. He told himself he should stand up, say something, call her name, but his body didn't move. The door closed behind her with a soft sound that barely registered in the cafe, yet echoed loudly in his mind. People continued talking around him. Cups clinked. Someone laughed at another table. Life went on, and Marlon realized that for the first time in a long while he had made a decision that didn't come with applause, approval, or immediate reward. Just a quiet absence where something important used to be. Marlon didn't fall into his new relationship. He stepped into it, carefully, deliberately, with the same mindset he used when making any other important decision in his life. She was introduced to him at a private dinner, well-spoken, confident, calm in a way that felt reassuring rather than exciting. Their conversation was easy, not intimate, not distant, just smooth. There were no awkward silences, no emotional risks, no moments that felt too real too fast. Everything unfolded in a way that felt managed. They met again, and then again. Eventually it became natural for her to stay over, for them to attend events together, for people to start referring to them as a couple. She fit into his life seamlessly. She understood his schedule. She respected his boundaries. She never asked for more time than he could offer. From the outside it looked perfect, and in many ways it was. There was comfort in the predictability, safety in the absence of emotional tension, a quiet relief in knowing that nothing between them required difficult conversations or vulnerability. Marlon told himself this was what stability felt like, a relationship that didn't challenge him, didn't unsettle him, didn't ask him to grow in uncomfortable ways. It simply existed. And for a long time, he believed that was enough. The house came next, not as a dream, but as a logical step. A quiet neighborhood, gated entrance, high ceilings, clean lines, rooms designed to impress more than to be lived in. Everything was new. The furniture chosen by professionals. The artwork selected for balance, not meaning. The lighting adjusted to make every corner look warm without actually feeling personal. Marlon walked through it the first night, barefoot on polished floors, noticing how his footsteps echoed slightly. It was beautiful, and strangely empty, not because it lacked people, but because it lacked memories. There were no mismatched mugs in the kitchen, no worn blankets on the couch, no signs of shared routines or inside jokes, just space, a lot of it. His partner loved the house. She spoke about how lucky they were, how perfect everything felt. Marlon smiled and agreed, but sometimes late at night, he found himself standing in rooms that were too quiet, realizing that for all its size, there was nowhere in the house that felt like home. Their conversations were always pleasant, not warm, not cold, just agreeable. They talked about work, upcoming events, travel plans, people they had met, topics that required opinions, not emotions, facts, not confessions. There were no raised voices, no long pauses, no moments that felt too personal. If one of them had a difficult day, the other offered practical solutions. If something felt uncertain, they reframed it into something manageable. They were good at being supportive, just not at being open. Marlon noticed that he rarely shared things that didn't have a clear purpose. He spoke about challenges, not doubts, achievements, not fears, and she did the same. They knew what was happening in each other's lives, but not what it meant. Sometimes during dinner, he caught himself waiting for a feeling to surface, a sense of connection, a moment of emotional closeness. But the conversations always ended where they began, polite, respectful, complete, as if they were two people performing a relationship instead of actually living inside one. Affection in Marlon's new life arrived on time, not spontaneously, not unexpectedly, but neatly placed between commitments and routines. They held hands at events because it looked right. They kissed goodbye before work because that was what couples did. They spent weekends together because their calendars allowed it. Nothing felt forced, but nothing felt surprising either. Intimacy followed patterns, even their closeness felt organized. A quiet understanding of when to be close, when to give space, when to appear connected. Marlon noticed how rarely either of them reached for the other without a reason. There were no sudden hugs in the kitchen, no shared laughter over nothing, no moments where time disappeared. Affection became something they scheduled instead of something that happened to them, and while it wasn't empty, it wasn't alive either. It felt like something they maintained, not something that grew. The distance didn't announce itself, it settled in quietly. Marlon found that even when they were together, his thoughts stayed somewhere else. He listened, responded, nodded, all the right gestures in the right order, but he rarely felt present. He stopped sharing small things, the kind of details that didn't matter but somehow made conversations feel personal. He kept stories brief, reactions measured, not because he was hiding, but because nothing inside him pushed to be seen. There were nights when they sat in the same room, each absorbed in their own screen, exchanging occasional comments without really engaging. He told himself this was normal, that every relationship eventually became calm, but the calm felt different from the one he had known before. This wasn't ease. It was absence without conflict, and the longer it lasted, the more he realized that being comfortable together wasn't the same as being connected. From the outside, Marlon's life looked flawless. His company reached new heights. Articles praised his leadership. Invitations arrived constantly. People spoke his name with respect, sometimes even admiration. He stood on stages, shook hands, smiled for cameras. Every achievement felt clean, measurable, easy to celebrate, but none of it changed how he felt when he went home. Success filled his schedule, not his inner world. He noticed how often he was congratulated, and how rarely he felt understood. The praise never made him uncomfortable. It just never made him feel anything. He had built a life where everything functioned exactly as it should, and yet something inside him remained untouched by it all, as if the most important part of himself had never been invited into the room. It wasn't sadness that bothered Marlon. He knew what sadness felt like. This was different. This was the quiet awareness that something essential was missing, without being able to name exactly what it was. He laughed at the right moments. He responded to messages. He fulfilled every responsibility placed in front of him. Life moved smoothly, too smoothly. There were no emotional waves, no deep highs or lows, just a steady surface that never broke. He felt like someone watching his own life from a distance, involved enough to function, removed enough not to feel. Not impressive, not successful, just real. And the only ones that came back to him were the quiet ones, on a couch, on a bench in a cafe, with someone who no longer existed in his present. He didn't go looking for them at first. It happened by accident. A late night, an old phone backup, a folder he hadn't opened in years. Frida's name appeared on the screen, and his finger hovered over it longer than he expected. When he opened the messages, there was no dramatic reaction, no rush of emotion, just a slow recognition. Their conversations weren't extraordinary. They talked about music, about work, about random thoughts that didn't need to be finished. But every message carried something his current life lacked: presence. She had asked questions, not out of obligation, but out of genuine interest. She had remembered details, followed up on things he forgot he'd even mentioned. He noticed how often he had used words like "I feel" back then, how rarely he used them now. Marlon didn't reread the messages to relive the past. He reread them to remember what it felt like to be emotionally awake. Reading those messages reminded Marlon of something he hadn't consciously missed. With Frida, he never had to explain himself. Not his moods, not his silences, not the parts of him that didn't make sense yet. He could arrive tired and say nothing, and she would understand it wasn't distance. He could talk in half-finished thoughts, and she would stay with him until the meaning arrived. There was no pressure to be consistent, no need to perform stability, no fear of being misunderstood. He realized that what he missed wasn't the relationship itself. It was the feeling of being emotionally safe, the sense that he could show up exactly as he was, without editing, without filtering, without turning himself into a version that fit better into someone else's expectations. In his current life, everything felt managed. Back then, nothing needed to be. And for the first time in 3 years, Marlon admitted to himself that safety had never been the problem. It was what he had walked away from Frida didn't leave in anger. There were no dramatic goodbyes, no emotional scenes at the train station, no long messages sent in the middle of the night. She simply reached a point where staying felt heavier than going. The city had too many corners that reminded her of conversations that no longer existed. Cafes where she expected to see him, streets they used to walk without direction. Even silence felt crowded there, so she packed what she needed, gave notice on her apartment, and moved somewhere smaller. Quieter. A place where no one knew her story and nothing carried meaning yet. It wasn't about escaping. It was about making space. Space to think without replaying the past. Space to feel without being pulled backward. Space to become someone who wasn't defined by what had ended. For the first time in a long while, Frida made a decision that didn't involve waiting for anyone else to choose her. She chose herself. Frida's new apartment was modest. 1 bedroom, a small kitchen, windows that let in more light than she expected. The kind of place that felt empty at first, but slowly learned her rhythms. The first few weeks were quiet, not lonely, just unfamiliar. She noticed how different it felt to wake up without checking her phone for messages that might never come, how evenings stretched longer without anyone else's schedule shaping them. She cooked for one, ate slowly, chose what she wanted without needing to consider someone else's preferences. At first, the freedom felt strange. Then, it felt honest. She learned what she liked when no one was watching, how she spent time when there was no one to impress, what kind of silence she enjoyed instead of endured. Living alone didn't make her happier overnight, but it made her clearer, and clarity, she realized, was the first step toward peace. Healing didn't arrive as a breakthrough. It came in small adjustments. Frida started noticing when she reached for her phone out of habit instead of need, when she replayed old conversations in her head instead of staying present, when she judged herself for feeling something that had already passed. She didn't force herself to forget. She allowed herself to feel without attaching meaning to it. Some days were easy. Some days felt heavy for no obvious reason. Most days were simply neutral. She began writing again, not for anyone else, just to organize her thoughts. She took long walks without music, letting her mind wander freely instead of filling every moment with distraction. Slowly, the memories stopped feeling like unfinished stories. They became part of her past instead of something she needed to solve. She didn't rush herself. She trusted that time, when given enough space, had a way of softening everything that once felt sharp. Frida met Drew in the most ordinary way, not through friends, not through an app, not through any moment that felt significant at the time. He worked at a local bookstore she visited often, the kind of place with handwritten recommendations and quiet corners where people lingered longer than they planned. At first, their conversations were brief. A comment about a book, a shared opinion about an author, a small joke that didn't need to land perfectly to feel natural. Drew wasn't charming in a way that demanded attention. He didn't try to impress her. He didn't ask too many questions. He was simply present. When he spoke, he looked at her. When he listened, he didn't interrupt. When there was silence, he didn't rush to fill it. One afternoon, as she paid for a novel she didn't really need, he said, almost casually, "You come here a lot. Want to grab coffee sometime?" There was no performance in his voice, no strategy, just a genuine invitation. And for the first time in a long while, Frida said yes without overthinking what it meant. Drew didn't arrive with grand gestures. He arrived on time. Every time they made plans, he showed up exactly when he said he would. If he needed to cancel, he explained why. If he said he'd call, he called. There were no mixed signals to interpret, no hidden meanings behind his words. What he said was what he meant. What he promised, he kept. Frida noticed it in small things, how he remembered details from earlier conversations, how he asked about her day and waited for the answer, how he never disappeared and reappeared with excuses. He didn't overwhelm her with attention. He simply stayed, and slowly she realized how unfamiliar that felt. Not excitement, not intensity, just steadiness. The kind of presence that doesn't need to prove itself because it isn't trying to compete with anything. Drew wasn't trying to be impressive. He was trying to be reliable. And for Frida, that felt more meaningful than any emotional speech ever could. What surprised Frida most about Drew wasn't what he did. It was what he didn't do. He didn't disappear when conversations became personal. He didn't change the subject when she spoke about difficult memories. He didn't grow distant when she admitted uncertainty. He stayed. When she talked about her fears, he didn't try to fix them. When she felt unsure, he didn't offer solutions. When she needed time, he didn't take it personally. He simply listened, not with the kind of attention that feels intense or overwhelming, but with a calm presence that made space for whatever she wanted to share. There were moments when Frida caught herself waiting for something to go wrong, for the distance, for the confusion, for the emotional shift she had learned to expect. It never came. Drew didn't require her to be certain about the future. He didn't ask her to explain her past. He didn't treat her feelings like problems to manage. He treated them like something to respect. And over time, Frida realized she wasn't guarding her heart around him. She was finally letting it rest. Their relationship unfolded without urgency. There was no moment where everything suddenly changed. No dramatic confession. No clear point where Frida felt she had crossed into something new. It grew the way trust often does, quietly. They spent time together in simple ways, cooking dinner, walking through the neighborhood, sitting in silence without needing to justify it. Nothing felt rushed. Drew never asked where they were going. He never pushed for labels. He never treated time like something that needed to be accelerated. And Frida noticed how different that felt from what she had known before. There was no pressure to become something impressive. No sense that she needed to be ready for the next step. No feeling that love was something to be negotiated. They were just two people, sharing space, learning each other's rhythms, allowing connection to arrive at its own pace. For the first time, Frida wasn't building a relationship around hope. She was building it around reality. The idea of marriage didn't arrive with fireworks. It came during a quiet afternoon. They were sitting on the floor of Drew's apartment, surrounded by half-packed boxes, deciding what to keep and what to let go of as they prepared to move into a place together. Frida picked up a mug with a chipped edge and smiled. "This one's seen better days." Drew looked at it, then at her. "So have I." They both laughed. After a moment, he said, "I like what we're building. I don't feel the need to rush it, but I also don't feel afraid of it." She considered his words, not as a proposal, but as a reflection of something she already felt. "I'm not afraid either," she said. They didn't kneel. They didn't make speeches. They didn't tell anyone right away. They simply decided, together, that this was the life they wanted to keep choosing. The ceremony, when it happened months later, was small. Friends, family, no performances, just two people committing to the quiet work of staying present for each other. The news came during a routine appointment Frida almost rescheduled. The doctor smiled before she even finished speaking. Drew squeezed her hand so tightly she laughed without realizing it. 3 heartbeats. 3. Frida sat in silence, her mind struggling to catch up with the words. Drew looked stunned, not frightened, just overwhelmed in the most honest way. "Are you sure?" he asked, half joking, half serious. The months that followed felt unreal. Cribs multiplied, clothes arrived in sets of 3. Friends joked about how their lives were about to change forever. And they were right. The nights became shorter, the days louder. The apartment filled with small cries, small hands, small moments that demanded full attention. It was chaotic, exhausting, beautiful in ways Frida never expected. She didn't feel like she had gained everything. She felt like she had finally arrived somewhere that made sense. Not because life was perfect, but because it was real. And for the first time, she wasn't waiting for anything else to begin. The park was louder than Marlon remembered. Children ran across the grass, parents called after them, dogs pulled at their leashes, and somewhere nearby, a street musician played a song no one seemed to be listening to. It felt alive in a way his world rarely did. He stood at the edge of the path for a moment, uncertain, as if stepping any closer might disturb something fragile. The air carried the smell of food from a nearby cart, mixed with the sound of laughter and overlapping voices. This wasn't a place for important conversations. It wasn't meant for reflection. It was meant for ordinary life. And yet, standing there, watching Frida in the middle of it, Marlon felt like he had wandered into a reality that no longer belonged to him. Everything around her moved naturally. Nothing waited for him. One of the children held a juice box tightly against their chest, while another reached for it, insisting it was their turn. "It's mine," the first one said, stubborn and serious. "You already had one," the second replied, trying to pull it away. The third stood between them, offering a solution that made sense only to themselves. Frida watched the scene unfold with amused patience, letting them speak before stepping in. "Okay," she said calmly. "We're not going to turn this into a competition." She took the juice, poured it into 3 small cups she had brought in her bag, and handed them out evenly. The argument ended instantly. The children accepted their cups, satisfied, and ran off together as if nothing had happened. Frida shook her head and smiled, the kind of smile that came from experience rather than surprise. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers, and Marlon realized he was watching a version of her that handled chaos with ease, not because life was simple, but because she had learned how to stay calm inside it. Frida leaned back on the bench, watching the 3 of them run in different directions, their voices blending into a joyful mess of sound. One of them tripped slightly, caught themselves, then burst into laughter as if it were the best part of the game. Frida laughed too, not the quiet, careful laugh Marlon remembered from cafes and late-night walks. This one was fuller, unrestrained, the kind that came from being completely inside a moment without thinking about how it looked. She called out their names, not to control them, just to remind them she was there. They shouted back, each one trying to be louder than the other. Frida smiled, shaking her head, clearly used to the noise, the unpredictability, the constant movement. There was no hesitation in her body language, no sense of distraction, no part of her that seemed pulled in another direction. She wasn't dividing her attention between what was happening and what used to be. She was fully present. And Marlon realized something quietly unsettling. He had never seen her laugh like this before, not because she hadn't been happy with him, but because this version of happiness didn't include any waiting at all. Marlon didn't plan to walk toward her. His body moved before his thoughts caught up. One step, then another. Each one felt heavier than it should have, as if he were crossing an invisible line he hadn't meant to step over. He rehearsed nothing. There were no prepared words this time, no careful sentences to protect him from whatever might happen. He stopped a few feet away, close enough for her to notice him if she looked up, far enough to turn back if he changed his mind. For a moment he considered leaving, pretending he hadn't seen her, letting the moment pass like all the others he had avoided over the years. But then one of the children ran back to Frida, and she looked up instinctively. Their eyes met, and suddenly there was no space left for hesitation. For a second neither of them moved. Frida's expression shifted, not to shock, not to confusion, just a quiet recognition, as if she had stumbled upon a memory that had stepped out of the past. "Marlon," she said. He hadn't realized how much he had missed hearing his name in her voice until that moment. Not the way people said it in meetings, not the way it appeared in headlines, just the way she used to say it, simple, familiar, human. "Hi," he replied, the word feeling strangely small in his mouth. She stood up slowly, brushing her hands against her jeans, her attention still partly on the children, who continued playing without noticing the shift in the world around them. "It's been a long time," she said. He nodded. "Yeah, it has." There was no tension in her tone, no distance either. Just a calm acknowledgement of something that had once mattered deeply and now existed in a different form. And in that single exchange, Marlon understood something he hadn't prepared for. She wasn't surprised to see him. She was simply aware of him. Frida looked at him the way people look at someone they once knew well, not searching for who they used to be, not trying to measure what had changed, just seeing what was in front of them. There was no rush in her movements, no stiffness in her posture. She didn't fold her arms or step back or lean in. She stayed exactly where she was. The children continued running behind her, their laughter drifting in and out of the space between them, but Frida didn't seem distracted by it. "I didn't expect to see you here," she said gently. "Of all places." He smiled faintly. "Neither did I." She nodded, accepting the coincidence without reading into it. "That's life, I guess," she added. "It shows up when you're not planning for it." Her voice carried no edge, no nostalgia, no tension, and for the first time since he'd approached her, Marlon felt something shift. This wasn't a reunion. It was simply two people crossing paths again, without unfinished emotions pulling them in opposite directions. Marlon glanced toward the children, who were now gathered near a small patch of grass, comparing sticks like they were valuable discoveries. He hesitated before speaking, unsure whether the question belonged to him anymore. The words came out softer than he intended, not out of disbelief, but out of awareness, the kind that knows an answer might change something inside you. Frida followed his gaze, watching them with an expression that felt instinctive rather than thoughtful. "Yes," she said simply. "They are." There was no hesitation in her voice, no explanation attached, no sense that she needed to justify anything, just a statement of fact. Marlon nodded slowly, as if absorbing information that had already been obvious but still required time to register, all connected to her in ways he would never understand. And in that moment, he realized the question hadn't been about curiosity. It had been about confirmation, about accepting, out loud, that her life had moved into a space where he no longer had any natural place to stand. Frida said the word again, softer this time. "Mine, not possessive, not defensive, just certain." She didn't elaborate. She didn't explain how old they were, or where they came from, or what her life looked like now. She didn't offer context or history. She didn't need to. The word carried everything it needed to. Marlon felt it settle in his chest, slow and heavy, like a truth finally finding its place. Mine, not ours, not someday, not maybe. A whole world contained in a single word, a world that had formed without him, grown without him, and no longer required anything from him. He smiled faintly, not because he felt okay, but because he didn't know what else to do with the feeling. "They're lucky," he said. Frida looked at the children again, one of them calling her name, the other two arguing over whose stick was bigger. Maybe, she replied. But I think I'm the lucky one. And in that moment, Marlon understood something quietly devastating. Her happiness wasn't built on what she had gained. It was built on what she had stopped waiting for. Marlon felt the shift before he understood it. Not sharp, not overwhelming. Just a slow inward movement, like something carefully held finally letting go. He had imagined many versions of this moment over the years. Some dramatic, some painful, some where he said the right thing and everything softened around him. None of them looked like this. There was no argument to win, no mistake to correct, no role left for him to play. Frida stood in front of him exactly as she was meant to be, grounded, calm, connected to a life that didn't circle back to him for meaning. The realization didn't hurt in a way he could describe. It simply emptied something inside him, not of love, not of memory, but of possibility, the kind that quietly disappears when you understand that a door didn't close because you were too late. It closed because the room no longer exists. And for the first time since he saw her across the park, Marlon accepted what he had been resisting all along. This wasn't a reunion. It was an ending he had arrived at 3 years too late to change. They sat on the bench side by side, leaving a small space between them without acknowledging it. Not because either of them felt uncomfortable, but because some distances don't need to be crossed to be understood. The children ran back and forth nearby, close enough for Frida to keep them in sight, far enough to give the two of them a moment of quiet. Marlon rested his hands on his knees, unsure what to do with them. Frida sat naturally, her posture relaxed, as if this conversation didn't require any special preparation. It felt strange how normal it all seemed. No raised emotions, no nervous laughter, no tension waiting to break. Just two people sharing a bench in a public place having a conversation that would never appear in anyone else's memory. For Marlon, the simplicity of it made everything heavier. He had imagined that if they ever spoke again, it would feel significant, emotional, charged with unresolved meaning. Instead, it felt calm. And that calm made him realize something quietly painful. This moment wasn't opening a chapter, it was closing one. The silence between them didn't feel uncomfortable. It didn't need to be filled. They watched the children for a moment, letting the sounds of the park carry the space. Distant laughter, footsteps on gravel, the faint music drifting from somewhere beyond the trees. Frida glanced at Marlon, then back at the kids. "They don't get tired easily," she said, almost amused. "I used to think I had endless energy. Turns out I just hadn't met my match." He smiled, genuinely, the first real smile since he'd seen her. I can imagine. There was no edge in his voice, no bitterness in hers. The conversation didn't feel like a confrontation. It felt like two people acknowledging something that had already settled. Neither of them seemed guarded. Neither of them seemed eager to perform. They weren't circling around old wounds. They were standing on ground that had already healed. And that made the absence of tension more powerful than any argument ever could, because it meant there was nothing left to defend. Marlon took a slow breath, the kind that comes when you stop trying to protect yourself from what you already know. "I used to think choosing the safe path meant I wouldn't lose anything," he said quietly. "I thought if I made the right decisions, the logical ones, everything else would fall into place." He paused, watching one of the children chase a bird across the grass. "But I didn't realize I was trading something I couldn't replace." Frida nodded slightly, not in agreement, not in disagreement, just in understanding. "I didn't lose a relationship," he continued. "I lost a way of being, the version of myself that wasn't always measuring outcomes." There was no self-pity in his voice, no attempt to soften what he was saying, and for the first time he wasn't speaking to justify the past. He was speaking to finally tell the truth about it. Marlon let the thought settle before continuing. "I didn't realize how much of myself I was leaving behind," he said. "Not all at once, just in small pieces. Every time I chose comfort over honesty, every time I avoided something that felt uncertain." He looked at Frida then, not searching for forgiveness, not hoping for reassurance, just sharing something he had never said out loud. "I thought I was building a better life, but I was really just building one that required less from me emotionally." She looked present. "That's easy to do," she said gently, "especially when everything around you rewards that kind of choice." Marlon nodded. "I know, and that's the part I didn't see. Success kept telling me I was doing everything right, but inside, I felt like I was slowly disappearing." He exhaled slowly. "I didn't lose you, Frida. I lost myself first." Frida listened without interrupting, her attention steady, her expression calm in a way that didn't feel distant. When he finished speaking, she didn't respond right away. She watched the children for a moment, one of them calling her name, the others laughing at something only they understood. Then she looked back at Marlon. "You didn't lose me," she said softly. "You just chose a life where I couldn't exist. They weren't meant to wound. They were simply true." Marlon felt them land slowly, not as an accusation, but as something final and clear. She wasn't telling him what he should have done. She wasn't explaining how things could have been different. She was naming what had already happened. "You needed certainty," she continued, "and I needed someone who wasn't afraid of not having it." There was no bitterness in her voice, no attempt to make him feel small, just a quiet understanding of two paths that had stopped overlapping a long time ago. And in that moment, Marlon realized she wasn't speaking from pain. She was speaking from peace. Marlon waited for the familiar feeling that usually followed hard truths, the urge to defend himself, to explain his reasons, to soften what had just been said. It didn't come. Instead, there was only a strange sense of relief. "I never thought you were wrong," he said quietly. "I just didn't know how to choose something that didn't feel secure." Frida nodded. "And I never thought you were cruel, just careful." They shared a small, almost amused smile, not because the situation was light, but because it finally felt honest. There was no anger left between them, no list of mistakes, no need to assign fault. What had happened wasn't the result of one person hurting the other. It was the result of two people wanting different kinds of safety. Marlon had wanted a life that protected him from risk. Frida had wanted a life that allowed her to feel fully alive. Neither of them had been wrong. They had simply stopped belonging to the same future. For a moment, Marlon considered saying something that had lived quietly inside him for years, that he still thought about her, that he wondered what might have happened if he had chosen differently. That part of him still felt connected to something that no longer existed, but the words stayed unspoken, not because they weren't true, but because they didn't belong here. This conversation wasn't about reopening doors. It wasn't about what-ifs. It wasn't about trying to soften the reality of where they stood. "I don't regret knowing you," he said instead. "I just regret not understanding myself sooner." Frida smiled faintly. "I don't regret anything," she replied. "Not even the parts that hurt." There was no longing in her voice, no sadness hiding behind the words. They weren't pretending the past hadn't mattered. They were acknowledging that it no longer defined them, and that was enough. They sat quietly for a moment, not because the conversation had ended, but because there was nothing left that needed to be said. The children ran back again, one of them asking Frida for help with a shoelace. She leaned forward instinctively, tying it without looking, her hands moving with practiced ease. Marlon watched her, not with longing, but with a strange sense of calm. There was no version of this moment where he belonged in that scene, and for the first time, he didn't feel the need to imagine one. "I'm glad you're happy," he said. Frida looked up surprised, not by the words but by how natural they sounded. "Thank you," she replied. "I'm glad you found what you were looking for too." He smiled softly. "I'm still learning what that is." She nodded. "That's okay. We all are." The closure didn't arrive as a dramatic feeling. It arrived as a quiet understanding that nothing between them was unfinished anymore. Their story had reached its ending, not because they stopped caring, but because they finally understood where it was meant to stop. Marlon stood up first. Not abruptly, not with hesitation, just naturally, as if his body understood what his mind had already accepted. "I should probably go," he said, more to himself than to her. Frida nodded. Yeah, they didn't hug, they didn't reach for each other. They didn't try to stretch the moment into something sentimental, because that version of their connection no longer existed. Marlon took a step back, then another, creating physical distance that finally matched the emotional one. "I'm glad I saw you," he added. "Even if it was like this." Frida smiled gently. "I think it was supposed to be like this." He held her gaze for a second longer, not with hope, not with regret, but with something quieter, understanding. Some stories don't end with conflict, they end with clarity. And as Marlon walked away, blending back into the movement of the park, he knew there was nothing left to fix, explain, or undo. Not because he didn't care, but because caring, this time, wasn't enough to change anything. This chapter had already been written, and for the first time, he didn't try to imagine a different ending. Marlon's drive home felt longer than usual, not because of traffic, not because he was lost in thought, but because there was nothing waiting for him at the end of it. The streets blurred past his window, familiar routes he had taken hundreds of times, each one leading back to the same place. The house stood exactly as it always had, quiet, polished, unchanged. He unlocked the door and stepped inside. No voices, No movement. No signs that anyone had noticed he was gone. He placed his keys on the counter, loosened his tie, and stood in the entryway for a moment longer than necessary. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was simply complete. He walked through the room slowly, noticing details he usually ignored: the untouched decor, the perfectly arranged furniture, the faint echo of his own footsteps. This time, the quiet didn't feel peaceful. It felt honest. For the first time in years, Marlon wasn't distracted by work, schedules, or expectations. He was alone with the version of his life he had built. And without Frida's presence anywhere in it, he finally saw it for what it was: not empty, but incomplete in a way no amount of success could disguise. That night, Marlon didn't turn on the television. He didn't scroll through messages. He didn't distract himself with emails. He sat on the edge of his bed and let the day settle. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel the need to protect himself from his own thoughts. He replayed the conversation in the park, not with regret, not with longing, but with a kind of calm attention. She had simply shown him what emotional courage looked like, and in doing so, she had quietly exposed the one thing he had avoided his entire adult life: risk. Not the kind measured in money or reputation, but the kind that comes from letting someone see you completely, without guarantees, without backup plans, without safety nets. He realized that everything he had built was designed to reduce uncertainty, and that the only thing uncertainty had ever given him was the chance to feel truly alive. For the first time, Marlon didn't think about what he had lost. He thought about what he had never allowed himself to try. The change didn't arrive with any sudden decisions. Marlon didn't quit his job. He didn't leave his life behind. He didn't make promises to become someone new overnight. What changed was quieter. He started paying attention to how he felt instead of how things looked. He noticed when he avoided conversations that felt too personal, when he chose comfort over honesty. He began letting people see parts of him he had previously kept private. Not everything, not all at once, just enough to feel present. He stopped rushing through moments that didn't lead anywhere productive. He learned how to sit with uncertainty without needing to solve it. And for the first time, success stopped being something he chased. It became something he questioned, not to reject it, but to understand what role it actually played in his life. Marlon hadn't found a new version of himself. He had simply stopped hiding from the one he already was. Frida returned to the bench where the children were now sitting in a loose circle, sharing snacks and comparing stories that only made sense to them. One of them ran toward her immediately, arms raised, asking if they could go to the playground on the other side of the park. "Give me 2 minutes," she said, smiling. "Then we'll go." She sat down beside them, tying a jacket around one small waist, brushing dirt off another's knees, listening to 3 different sentences at once without asking any of them to slow down. The world she stepped back into was noisy, demanding, constantly in motion, and yet she felt completely at ease inside it. The conversation with Marlon didn't linger in her mind, not because it hadn't mattered, but because it no longer needed space there. She didn't carry unanswered questions. She didn't replay old choices. She didn't wonder who she might have been. She had built something real, something that didn't require reflection to feel meaningful. Frida wasn't thinking about the past as she walked toward the playground. She was thinking about which child needed the swing first. Later that evening, after the park, Frida's apartment filled with the kind of noise that only existed when no one was trying to control it. Shoes were kicked off in different corners. Toys ended up in places they didn't belong. Someone insisted on eating dessert before dinner, and someone else protested loudly about it. Frida moved through it all with practiced ease. She stirred a pot on the stove while answering 3 questions at once. She wiped juice from the counter, kissed a forehead, laughed at a story that didn't make sense but didn't need to. There was no dramatic sense of fulfillment in the moment. No thought of this is what happiness looks like. It was simpler than that. She felt settled, not excited in a way that demanded more, not proud in a way that needed recognition, just quietly grounded in the life she was living. Her evenings weren't impressive. They weren't glamorous. They weren't something anyone would envy from the outside. But when she lay down at night, tired in the best way, she didn't feel like she was waiting for anything else to begin. This wasn't the life she once imagined. It was the life she had chosen, and that made all the difference. There was no moment where either of them reached for their phone that night, no sudden doubt, no quiet hope that the day had meant something different. Marlon didn't sit in his house imagining what might have happened if he had said more. Frida didn't lie awake wondering what would have changed if she had felt less calm. Because nothing about their meeting invited fantasy. It had been clear, honest, complete. They hadn't missed each other. They had simply recognized each other. And recognition didn't carry the same weight as longing. There was no version of the story where they tried again. No secret desire left unresolved. No emotional thread pulling them back into the same narrative. What they shared belonged fully to the past, not in a tragic way, Not in a romantic way, just in the way some chapters end exactly where they're meant to, without needing to be rewritten to feel meaningful. Marlon woke up the next morning with a feeling he hadn't experienced in a long time. Not motivation, not regret, just a quiet sense of clarity. The day didn't feel heavy. It didn't feel urgent either. It simply felt honest. He made coffee and stood by the window, watching the city begin to move. Cars passed. People walked. Life continued in its familiar rhythm. For the first time, he didn't feel separate from it. He didn't try to measure where he was compared to where he thought he should be. He didn't replay conversations or imagine different outcomes. He accepted the life he had built, and the parts of it that would never exist. Not with bitterness, not with self-pity, with understanding. Acceptance didn't feel like giving up. It felt like finally letting go of the need to prove something to himself. And in that quiet release, Marlon found something he hadn't known he was missing. Peace, not because everything was perfect, but because he had stopped resisting what was real. That evening, Marlon took a longer walk than usual. No destination, no purpose, just movement. He passed cafes where people sat in conversation, parks where couples shared benches, apartments where lights glowed behind curtains. Ordinary scenes he had once rushed past without noticing. This time he paid attention, not with longing, not with comparison, with presence. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about what he needed to become next. He wasn't calculating outcomes or managing impressions. He was simply there, existing inside his own life instead of standing outside it. And in that quiet awareness, Marlon understood something simple and grounding. He hadn't failed at love. He had just learned, too late, what kind of love required courage instead of comfort. But late didn't mean meaningless. It meant honest. And honesty, even when it arrived slowly, still had the power to change the way a person lived. Marlon returned home and stood for a moment in the doorway, the city lights casting a soft glow across the floor. Nothing had changed in the house, and yet everything had. He didn't feel the need to fill the silence anymore. He didn't feel compelled to escape it either. It was just space, neutral, open, waiting for whatever he chose to bring into it next. He placed his keys down, not with routine, but with intention. For the first time, he wasn't thinking about who he used to be or who he thought he should become. He was thinking about who he was now. Not perfect, not unfinished, just present. And that, he realized, was enough. Thank you for staying with this story, not just for listening, but for giving your time to something quiet, something human, something that doesn't rush to entertain you with noise or spectacle. Stories like this only work when someone chooses to sit with them. So if you're still here, it means you didn't just watch, you felt something. And that's what this channel is really about, creating space for moments that feel real, even when they're uncomfortable, even when they don't end the way we expect them to. Take a moment and think about the people in your own life, not the ones you lost through conflict or distance, but the ones you lost through timing, fear, or choices that felt reasonable at the time. The ones who didn't leave in anger, the ones who simply grew into different futures. Those are often the stories that stay with us the longest, not because they were dramatic, but because they were honest. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Not polished opinions, not perfect lessons, just whatever came up for you while listening. Sometimes reading someone else's reflection is how we understand our own. And if you know someone who's been navigating a quiet ending of their own, someone who chose comfort over connection or connection over certainty, consider sharing this story with them. Not as advice, just as a reminder that they're not alone in what they're feeling. Some people don't leave your life because love disappears. They leave because fear wins first. And sometimes the bravest thing a person can do isn't holding on. It's finally understanding why they let go. If you enjoy stories like this, real, emotional, and grounded in everyday human choices, you're always welcome here. Subscribe to Mr. Cooper Stories, and we'll keep telling the kind of stories that don't shout for attention. They stay with you quietly instead.